All right, ladies and gentlemen, I am excited to have a new guy that I just met not too long ago and I've gotten to know a little bit, a guy named Dusty. For most of you, you know that a lot of these interviews I do are fire chief based or they're police chief or they're in law enforcement. But every once in a while, I come across somebody who I think just epitomizes a different part of leadership, a part that I really appreciate, who has a good view of it, but also who has a really good experience with it. And Dusty's that. When I was first getting into, hey, do I coach? Do I do executive leadership? What do I do? Dusty's a name that stood out above that. And because of a common faith that we have, I set up an interview, we talked, and just a tremendous amount of respect really early on for who he is, how he sees things. And so I wanted to bring him in front of whoever's listening so that you guys can be exposed partly to who he is as a man, his character, also his leadership and skill ability, and then some of the tools that he's designed that I think just more and more people need to know about. So, Dusty, thank you so much for being a part of this call and taking time to interview with me today.
Michael, thank you so much. Looking forward to the opportunity to talking with you and the rest of your audience.
Cool. So a little bit about Dusty, and then I'm just going to have Dusty tell you about himself. He has been an executive for quite a while in some pretty senior roles. Some of the ones that I saw on your LinkedIn profile, CDF, which is a development fund for churches. What was the annual kind of operating expenses in CDF, just to give people a context?
Well, the overall assets, we were about 650 million in assets. So as a 65-year-old savings and loan fund for churches, we'd done about, I think in our history, about $2 billion in loans to churches through the years, 10,000 investors around the country who were part of making that good work happen.
Okay, good. And I say that not to, to brag about you a little bit, yeah, but also just give people a context, because I think sometimes we're going, okay, hey, is it mom and pop or was it something global? And I know with CDF, this had a global impact. And so people can kind of begin to get a sense for what kind of a leader you are. You led Dallas Christian College for how many years?
I was president there for 10 years. That was a passion project. I did my undergrad work at Dallas Christian, totally changed my life, changed the trajectory of my life and leadership. And so when I had the opportunity to come back there as president, I was quite excited about it. The interview committee said, "What's the first thing you'll do when you come back as president?" I said, "Well, as a former student, I'll have all my student records sealed. That'll be the very first thing
yes.
that needs to happen." So no, that was a great decade of life and leadership.
Well, good. Give me one or two more leadership things you've been involved in, and then I just want to ask you to kind of give us like your personal story, who you are, wife, that kind of stuff. But what other type organizations have you led or worked with?
Yeah, before that, I was president and CEO of the Christian Network International. It was the owner of the Worship Television channel. So this was back in the late 90s, early 2000s. We were on 70% of U.S. households, broadcasted in 50 countries.
Oh, wow.
And just a great opportunity in the media world at an interesting time when the internet was really just taking off. So we had the chance to do some kind of unique things in the internet, launch some specifically religious Christian internet companies at that time. And part-time for a couple of those years, I was also the CEO of the North American Christian Convention, which was international annual convention of church leaders. And so kind of the trajectory of that part of my career, I spent 25 years as a CEO, 4 different organizations, all of them in some form of either being stuck or truly turnaround situations. So really, what developed for me, I hadn't intended to do this, but what developed for me was building a set of tools for being the turnaround guide, but specifically in quite unique not-for-profit organizations that all had very big for-profit aspects of how they operated.
Okay, cool. And I want to come back to that because the audience that I've kind of cultivated over a while is in kind of the fire and law enforcement space, which it's not profit, it's not nonprofit. And so I think some of the things that you've learned, some of the things you teach, I think would be a real interest to people. Like, well, when you talk about these change, elements, what are they and how do they work? I can think of a couple of chiefs I'm working with right now who are going through some massive unstucking, some changes, and they're going, what's the life cycle on that? And can I change it in 3 months, or is it going to take me 12 years? And so I'd love to get some perspective on that. But tell us a little bit about like you, family, kind of hobbies, that kind of stuff, and then we'll jump into some of the work stuff.
Yeah, thanks for asking. I grew up in Nebraska. My dad had a large farm and feedlot. Really kind of thought that's what I was going to do with my life. I was the youngest of three boys. And after going to college for a year, I realized I wasn't going to do that. Um, I always had a sense that I'd end up in leadership
Yeah.
someplace, and specifically as a CEO someplace. Even as a kid sitting on a tractor at the farm, I just had a sense of uh, this is where I'm headed. And
Yeah.
for me, it didn't result in having a lot of ego attached to that. What it had attached was, if that's the case, I need to start preparing young. And
So,
so I did
so hit
everything I
on that.
could.
Give me that just a little bit, Dusty, because that's so unique, right? Like most guys I know, they're like, if I feel called to lead, ego's the first thing that comes on. So what caused that? Like, what caused you to see it that way?
Well, I think part of what caused it, I was close in with some organizations that had some really epic leadership failures that I got to witness as a young man, and I saw the pain that it caused my family,
Mhm.
and one of them specifically in a church, just what it caused there. And I realized leadership is not something to be taken lightly; it's something to prepare for. So I began reading books pretty early on leadership. Started my first business actually in fourth grade. You'll
Nice.
love this, selling chickens door to door. I raised
Yes.
chickens on the farm.
Alive or dead? Were they alive or dead? That's what I gotta know.
Well, I raised them up into 4 pounds, had them cleaned, and then sold them packaged, ready to go
That's awesome.
to friends and neighbors, and did that for quite a few years and made kind of all my early money and did some other sales things, multi-level sales. But all of that was just part of that leadership journey. But I just kept having the opportunity of seeing up close and personal, really epic leadership failures. And from my perspective as a young man, thinking most of these are somewhat predictable, certainly preventable.
Yeah.
How are we going to do that differently? So I know that really kind of created in my mind these ideas that if I were there, here's what I would do differently. If I was there, here's what I would do to change it. And the first CEO job that came along was a 5-year-old organization that had had 7 year or seven changes of CEO
In
um,
five
in,
years.
in those first 5 years. And so, needless to say, some dysfunctions had developed in the culture. And so for me, it just became a blast of going into, whether as the CEO or as an advisor, to going into an organization, diagnose what's wrong, what could be better, and then lay out the path of how we make that happen. You said family. This year's my 40th wedding anniversary, so my
Oh,
wife Kathy
very
and I
good.
are celebrating that. We've got two adult kids. Our daughter, son-in-law, and two grandkids live just a mile from us,
Oh,
and
nice.
so we spend a lot of time with them. My son and his wife don't have any children yet. They also live in the great state of Texas, and hobbies, reading for years, got pretty serious about cooking over the years.
Okay.
Motorcycle riding has kind of been my only real outside outlet that's been meaningful to me for years.
Street
So,
bike or dirt bike?
well, both. I ride the BMW Adventure bike, which is
Okay.
a tremendous highway bike, but
Yeah.
also very good off road as well.
Okay. Cool. And
Yep.
then you said you went to Dallas Christian College. Where did that fit into kind of your journey as like preparing?
Well, I think it was a tremendous setting for leadership development, a pretty small private college. It's there that I decided I wouldn't be farming and that I'd get into some life of service and leadership. And, it was a really unique time. The mentors that I had there were very, very impactful. It's a small college that's intensely focused on mentoring students at all different levels. I had a lot of leadership opportunities, much younger than I would have. Frankly, if I'd have been at a big college,
Mhm.
I'm sure I wouldn't have had those leadership opportunities. And there was just a real sense at that college of practical leadership. This is how you get things done in the world, and I just found that to be very valuable. Also, I wanted to do an MBA. That didn't go away. So some years later, Indiana Wesleyan University, I added an MBA, and for me, it was a really interesting my undergraduate degree was pastoral ministries and biblical studies, and then I added on to that an MBA, a general MBA, and the combination of those two things about one is really about humans, how humans work and how life works and the spirit works. The other was how business works. Ended up just being a tremendous combination.
Yeah, I appreciate that. That's similar to my story where I went to Bible college after the Air Force, and it was biblical studies and pastoral studies. And I went into ministry for years. And then just within the last 5 years, went back, got a master's in leadership. And you're right, you get like the people focus, and then you get kind of the organizational parts focus. And the way those two overlap is beautiful. I mean, it's really interesting to see how they nuance. So the way we met originally, because this leads into a question I have for you, is I was starting into coaching. And I knew I wasn't, coaching's not a space I really wanted to go into. I love executive leadership. I love parts. I love diagnostics. But at the time, I was like, oh, that's a coach. And so I'm looking around, and I'm looking for people that I respect. And I encounter you, only you're not a coach, you're an executive advisor. And so I'm beginning to go like, okay, hang on, there's a different space there, right? And you and I were talking earlier. I love what some coaches are doing, but I think coaching has become this big generalized thing where people just go, hey, you know what? I read a book. I'm a coach. And I know that at executive level leadership, we need advisement, we need diagnostics, we need skills training. We do need coaching as a piece of that, but at a very high level, not just at an entry level. I really want to help. And so what I would love is for you to talk about, you're an executive advisor and you coach as part of that, but you're not a coach. So help me understand that, because I think there's real value in your perspective and what you do.
Well, when I began to think seriously about stepping away from full-time CEO work, I knew what I would do next would look like this. And I also struggled, I guess I could use the word, I struggled a little bit with how executive coaching has evolved
Yeah.
in the US, and I've got great respect for it. It's growing fast. It seems that more leaders are open to coaching and mentoring than ever before. I think that's great. I think that if you were to use a sports metaphor, you look at an NFL team or Major League Baseball, whatever it is, there's all types of coaches. There's
Right.
coaches who were players, they bring a particular perspective. There's conditioning coaches and batting coaches. And so there's really narrow coaches and some who it comes out of their experience, some they simply learned how to coach in that area. I think both are very valid. For me, when I set out to do this, I just wanted to make it pretty clear that I'm a player's coach,
Yeah.
right? And so 25 years as a CEO, all of those years in turnaround or stuck organizations, I calculate on the way low end, I spent 50,000 hours of life in the CEO seat, way low end. It
Yeah.
was considerably higher than that. And so the perspective that I bring to a newer CEO or a younger CEO, I've been through a lot. You
Yeah.
talked about some of your chiefs who are going through some stuck situations, turnaround situations. You can count the number of years. You can't count how many years it takes off of your life. I always consider they're really dog years, right?
It's the truth.
1 year in a crisis situation is 7 years in the rest of the world. And I have so much respect for the leaders that you work with. They deal with crises I can't even imagine. So, yeah, just literally hats off to what they're doing. So, as I looked at it, I chose executive advisory as the name, as a name and descriptor for my firm, but more importantly for what I do. And I see that it has three streams. One of those streams is I do a lot of mentoring. Mentoring's all about personal growth.
Yeah.
I do quite a bit of coaching, which I consider all about the professional side
Yeah.
of leadership. And then third, a lot of consulting, which is all about organizational growth. So, from my perspective, that's kind of the trifecta of what I can bring to any organization. I've been involved in being mentored and mentoring for decades, coaching and being coached for decades, consulting and having consultants for decades. And what I find that oftentimes clients are attracted to the coaching piece, but sooner or later it turns into a mentoring piece.
Yeah.
And sooner or later something comes up with the organization. And since I've had the really the privilege to work in such a broad type of organizations over so many years in every type of economy, I find that most cases, what they're up against, I've been through something very similar. So I'm not just talking about what could be done. I can talk about here's what I did, and here's 5 reasons why you should absolutely run the other way because I was wrong, because I was wrong completely. And I mean, I think that's the test. That's one of the things of a great advisor versus somebody who just hung out a shingle
Yeah.
is I can speak from the place of tremendous mess ups. And those are the absolute best lessons in life. And hopefully, I can help the people that I'm working with, the CEOs, the boards, the senior team members. Hopefully, they can learn some of the things to avoid,
Yeah,
along with the things to do.
it's interesting because as you break it out, I think back to when I was leading churches of all different sizes, and I can remember encountering coaching and really feeling like it had a place.
Yeah.
But the problem I had was there were times I was like, look, if you've had experience in this, I need you to speak to that. And the
Yeah.
coaches I was working with a lot of times, like, well, how do you feel about that? Well, what do you think? And I remember my impatience as an executive leader being like, I don't have time if you have an answer to figure this out. Like, just tell me. And so what I love about kind of as you're breaking it down, you're like, hey, there are times to help somebody self-discover. There's also times to go, hey, listen, I know some stuff. Let me share it with you. I'm not saying you have to take it, but I'm giving you a perspective. And then I love too, organizationally going, sometimes it's just nuts and bolts. Sometimes it really just is, hey, you're structurally out of whack here. So let's deal with this. And so I love that you're kind of making this case for, yeah, coaching's a piece, but coaching isn't all of that. That those are all different things. And so I think I'm hoping anyone that's listening at executive level who maybe has pushed back in the past, I don't want to coach, I don't want someone talking to me about my feelings, to go like, okay, well, there's more to it. And so I think that leads into my next question. Like, as an executive's listening right now, and they've done it all on their own. So a lot of the guys I work with, man, they have worked their butts off. They have built themselves from the ground up, and they would say they've had people help them, but they're in this executive role. They're trying to figure out, how do I bring somebody in without abdicating my leadership? Talk to me about like what benefits working with an executive advisor. Like, how does that benefit them in real life where they're going, this is worth my time and energy?
Well, it's different for everyone I work with, and obviously you'd get more accurate answers by asking them, right?
Right.
I'm a little bit in oftentimes say in my humble but also likely correct opinion. Sorry, I think that in a sense, the advisor works as a one-person board. So it is a highly confidential relationship. It is a one-on-one. We get to dive in wherever the CEO wants to go or the executive wants to go. And I'm constantly reminding when we talk once or twice a month, I'll start out with a few suggestions. I'd like to talk about this and this today, but here's the shift. I'm on your agenda, and
Right.
that's it. I'm on your agenda. So where are you having pain? Where are you having frustrations? What are the things you're laying awake at night about? What are those things? Let's just dive into those. So again, that's really my framework is their agenda. My
Yeah.
framework is their personal growth, their professional growth, organizational growth, wherever we need to go with that. And so I simply find that in this relationship, as I've had advisors in the past and as I advise others, I'm one of those places where they can say anything that they want or need to say in
Yeah.
confidentiality. They can test out ideas and say, am I crazy, or
Yeah.
or does it really work like this? They can say, all right, I've got a big project, need to meet with my board. Let's talk about how I tee the. It's just that one-on-one meeting wherever they're at with what they need to be doing in a confidential manner. I find that it ends up really. I don't want to say the leaders lack confidence, but it's a real confidence booster if you can be working these things out in real life and getting confirmation of the direction that
Yeah.
you're going.
When you say that, it makes me think of a safe brainstorming place to go, listen, before you
It's
go
a
and
part.
go to your board, is to
It's a
say,
part.
yeah, I
Yeah.
think this, and could it work this way? And where are the blind spots I don't see? And what are the things I maybe am over assuming, and to have a, I think of executives to have a safe place to do that. Most executives, I know, they love to play in that space, but it's
Yes.
not safe because if you do it in front of your board, you could lose your job. And and they
Good.
don't want to do it
Good.
alone. So I love this idea of like, hey, it's a safe place to try something. It's a laboratory of sorts.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the big challenges, and I'm sure you run into this, having been in the seat for 25 years, I'll have a someone that I'm advising will begin talking about a problem or an issue. Well, for 25 years, I solve those issues, right?
Right, right.
and I'll find myself all of a sudden, if it's a Zoom call, I'll find myself leaning way up on the camera saying, "Here's what you have to," and then I'm like, "Whoa, whoa, 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 whoa,
Yeah,
reel it back in, Rubeck. You're the CEO. I'm not. Forgive
yeah,
me."
yeah,
But I am a recovering CEO, and it's really hard. I've only been out of the seat for about a year and a half. I still get really emotionally invested in those things and want to say, "Do this, don't do
yeah,
that,"
yeah,
and that that doesn't work very good. I learned a really important principle a few years ago. The greater I insist, the greater others resist.
oh yeah,
Right?
absolutely.
That is true in leadership. That's true in coaching. That's true in marketing. The
Yeah.
greater I insist that someone, it's just natural human nature. The brain is going to say, "You say I have to do that? Well, then that's the last thing
Oh
I'm
yeah.
going to do."
I'll give you an example that you'll get a kick out of. So I was trying to figure out this coaching thing. I've done a lot with, kind of diagnostics and helping, hey, this is where you are and this is where you need to go. And so I tried to go into the coaching space, and I'm new to it. And I do this hour and a half long coaching session with this guy, and it's a wrestling match. I mean, he's saying something. I'm like, no, no, come on. Like, we need to press in. And we finish it up. And I go, so how was that for you? He goes, that was miserable. He goes, you're horrible at this, man. And I said, why is that? He goes, I just wanted someone to listen to me. He said, you had way too many answers. And I was like, oh man. So I had to go back and reflect. And it was some of that like, no, no, I know. And then going, my place is to be a resource. It's not to go, no, I have the answer and here it is. And that, boy, that was an adjustment. It was really hard for me. So I just never forget him going, oh, this is horrible. And I'm
Yeah.
going, okay.
And you really hit on a thing that years ago I began to focus on how do I ask better questions, but in this role, it really forces me to get much better at that. So
Yeah.
much
Yeah.
of what we do is through the asking of questions. But
Yeah.
but again, occasionally the CEO look me eye to eye and say, "Tell me, what's your opinion? What
Yeah.
should I do?" And
Yeah.
I am not shy.
Good.
So
Well, and I think most executives are.
I tell them, take take my advice or not. Here's my opinion. So
Yeah. Well, before I move on, because I want to get to some of the tools you use, I think it'd be really cool. But I'm curious if someone's wanting to go in this space that you work in, right? This executive advisement, this kind of diagnostics with organizations. What are some of the skills and temperaments that you would say, hey, I really think that you need to make sure you have these to be successful at it? Because, man, I see people who are like, I'm willing. Okay, willing's cool. But I mean, talk to me more on the professional level. What makes you, and in all humility, what makes you good at what you do that somebody else would be like, hey, I need to be good at those things?
well, I'd go back to the sports team analysis again. If you are great at batting and that's what you're great at, then coach that,
Yeah.
right? And so recognize the limitations of your strengths and experience. For me, the uniqueness I bring is 25 years of broad-based uh, and broad-based leadership, broad-based crises that I've been through, uh, expertise in a lot of different areas that's been developed over a very long period of time. Um, I'm thinking of a quote from Liam Neeson right now, a particular set of skills and
Yeah.
experiences.
That's a great quote.
But I think that's the thing. Recognize where you really do have something to say,
Yeah.
and more importantly, recognize where you don't have something to say.
Yeah.
And so when I'm working with a client, at times for me to say, "Hey, you're in waters that I've not been in and I don't know, so I'm not going to make it up." Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the great damages of what's going on in kind of the advice culture right now is overstepping the boundaries. I mean, it really it it takes some humility, and that's not easy for me, right? It takes some humility to step into the lives of these organizations and leaders and really empathize with what they're going through, really listen carefully without trying to come up with an answer, and then humbly suggest, here are some ways you should go. And that doesn't come naturally to me. I don't think it comes naturally to lots of CEOs. But yeah, I think that's the thing. Know what your space is. Continue to grow in that space. If you want to add a broader space, then do the work.
Right.
But don't just hang it out there, or don't just make it up. I read a book, therefore I can consult you on this
Yeah.
area. If you're working at really lower levels of initial leadership, you can get away with that. But man, when you are messing around in the head and the life of a CEO and a board of significant organizations, you got to be careful that you don't do any damage.
Yeah, I love the idea of putting in the work. So I was going through a church planning assessment once, and we were working with this team, and one of the guys pulls me aside and he says, "Hey, Mike," this case we were going to do some church planning internationally, and he said, "If this doesn't work out, what are you going to do?" And we were having this conversation, and I planted a church, so I'd led a church of about 250 from scratch. And I said, well, I'd really like to be in a church of about 1,000, 1,500. And he's listening, and he's just nodding. He's like, yeah, tell me about that. And I'm like, well, I think I'm bigger and bigger staff, bigger budget, bigger all this stuff. And I'll never forget, and right or wrong, I mean, it was good for me to hear. He goes, at the time I was young, he said, you young guys, he goes, you're going to skip all the work that it takes to be that leader. You just want that leadership spot. And I remember just being offended. I'm like, what do you don't know nothing. And then I get back and God's kind of like, hey, let's talk about that. And I remember thinking, oh, yeah, we want to skip the work and just have the place. And one of the things I hear as you talk about this in a very good way is do the work. Like if you're a batting coach, be a good batting coach. But just because you want to be a pitching coach doesn't mean you get to go over there and go, hey, this is how I would throw the ball. Like, hey, can you pitch? Because either become a great pitcher who can then coach pitching, or maybe leave pitching up to somebody else. And I think in the coaching space and the executive advisement space and in all that space, that would be a great thing for people to hear is, hey, figure out what you're good at. And that doesn't mean you're limited to it. But what it does mean, if you're not good at this yet, you need to go get experienced at it, not just have an opinion about it. And I do think that could change that space dynamically.
I do as well. When I first became a college president, a good friend sent me a book on leadership by Robert Semple, I believe it was, A Contrarian's Guide to Leadership. Fantastic book. I still recommend it. He was a really influential university leader on the West Coast, and he kind of goes through these lessons he learned about contrarian leadership. And I just remember one of the quotes in the book was, a lot of people want to be the president, not many people want to do what the president has to do.
That's true.
I've adapted that through the years as a CEO, and I've found that in every organization, there's lots of people who think they could be the leader,
Right.
lots of people who want to be the leader, not many people who actually want to do the work that has to be done. And that's what I found again is one of the things that sustained me 25 years in that CEO role was yeah, I didn't want to just be the leader. I wanted to do the things that were required
Yeah.
to lead. And one of the things I noticed to my disappointment in the waning years of my leadership, I began to realize that's beginning to decline.
Mm-hmm.
And my desire to help other leaders in their careers and their leadership was on the way up. And that's where, in my late 50s, I made that decision. I'm going to step away earlier than I had intended.
Yeah.
I think it's the right thing to do because what I see is this opportunity. I look at the first 30 years of my life all about learning, right? That's when I got my college degrees. I had some jobs. The next 30 years were all about leading, 25 of it from the CEO seat, which is pretty special opportunity. But as I look at the next season of life, to me, this is all about leaders, right? So
Yeah.
I had that chance to lead. I'm thankful for it. Perhaps I'll do that again. I don't know. I'm not
Yeah.
looking for such a thing, but if it comes along, I'll certainly consider it. But to me, there is that sense of the next season, I've got to take what I learned about leadership and I've got to invest it in younger leaders or newer leaders. Some are older than me, they just haven't been in leadership as long.
Right.
That's what this season of life is going to be for me is leaders.
Yeah. I just absolutely love that distinction of if you want to be the leader, you've got to like doing what the leader does, not just his position, not just his pay. And I've said for a long time when I was leading church staffs, I was like, the difference between a student pastor, a worship pastor, and a senior pastor is what they do. Their levels
Yep.
of responsibility change, but I was like, that nobody needs to be jumping into somebody else's role unless they really like that work. And I've seen guys switch roles because they want, I want to be on the stage, or I don't
Yep.
want to be on the stage. And I just think, man, you got to love the work that you're doing. And so I think the distinction with leaders, like, hey, love what you do it really, really well. And then I think the other example that you give is be okay with when that begins to wane to go, what else is rising? And stepping towards the rising thing instead of going, man, you know what? I'm in my 50s and I've been a CEO, so this is what I'm going to ride it out doing. Going, man, your organizations deserve better. And so that you would step aside before you had to and go, no, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to take what I've learned, and I've got this desire to really pour into leaders. And I love your call too. It's not just young leaders; it's new leaders. And man, I think there's guys in their 50s, 60s, there's ladies in their 50s and 60s who they're going to be phenomenal leaders. They just haven't been yet. And that you make space for that, I think is really, really cool. So talk to me about some of the tools that you use, specifically some that you've designed. I want to hear about the 5 levers, and other tools that you find really effective working in the space that you work in.
Yeah, that's been kind of an interesting evolution and learning for me. Is what I thought I was setting out to do, of course, hasn't turned out to be what I'm doing. So the 5 levers came from this. I've always been really passionate about culture. The couple things I'm very passionate about: corporate culture, and one is personal influence, right? So the influence of the leader. So a lot of things I've developed through the years were around that. But this idea of corporate culture has always intrigued me long before it became cool.
Right.
It just, from an early stage, I began to recognize there is a thing about corporate culture. Corporate culture, it's like the river, right? You can put a dam on the river, you can put some bank on it, you can try to reroute the river, but ultimately, when the big rains come, the river always wins.
Yeah.
It will go the way that it's going to go. And so for me, that became culture. You can put all these artificial things in place, but the culture of the beast, it's going to go where the culture is going.
Right.
And certainly 20 some years ago, there were books about culture, but a lot of it was just pretty soft, touchy feely stuff.
Yeah.
And I'm not that. And it really bothered me. And so I thought there's got to be a way that you can truly measure objectively culture and then manufacture the culture you want.
Yeah.
And so I did a lot of reading, a lot of studying, my own analysis of what I was seeing. And I developed what I called the 5 levers of corporate culture. And so I implemented that in my turnarounds. I've used it in consulting with other organizations. I teach on it now at Vistage and other places. Yeah, so that's one of my key tools. So it's a tool by which we can all have a shared framework about this is what creates culture. We can determine exactly the type of culture we want to have. We can determine the gap, and from there, very measurable. If you do this X, Y, Z, not simple but measurable, we can, I believe, manufacture any culture that you want to have. And so that one I'm very passionate about. I thought that's what I'd be doing. That only gets asked rarely of me
Yeah.
to do that. So it's in standby. I think it's a great book if I
So
like
what
to
what
read.
are the is it a book? Is it a book people can pick up,
It's
or
not a book. It's not a book. It should be
okay?
a book. Too late now. There's too many bad books about culture out there.
So
So
what? So go as far as you're willing or not willing to go. What are the 5 levers?
I'm willing to go as far as you want to go.
Yeah, give me the 5 levers, because if I'm listening right now and I'm intrigued, I'm going,
It's
yeah,
it's
okay, but what is it?
it's not a 30-second thing, but this is as close as it gets. The 5 levers are these: history, mission, vision, values, and norms. And when I assess any organization, and we've done this kind of rapid, we'll put a leader in front of the room and say, tell us about the dysfunction in your organization. When we've taught everybody the tools, the 5 levers, and then we'll say, all right, what levers do you need to pull on to correct those things? It hasn't failed yet. It will someday.
Yeah.
Who is it said all models are wrong, some models are useful, right? So there's certainly there's flaws somewhere, but we found it useful. there's some relationship to the history, some lack of clarity in the mission, some division on the vision, a lack of living out clear values, norms that are out of line. Those 5 things, I can assess any culture in a pretty short period of time and put together actual measurable strategies of how you can begin to build that culture to where you want it to go. And remember, part of the problem in corporate culture stuff today is a few years ago it became all about engagement.
Right.
High engagement was great culture. Great culture is measured by high engagement. No, that's only one. That's only one element of a culture. Engagement might not be. You can have highly engaged people all going in the wrong direction.
Right.
Right. That's not good culture. So culture is situational. Let me just back up. One of the key things that became clear to me years ago about leadership is always and only situational, right? The leadership that is needed, the leadership that is required is directly related to the situation at hand.
Right.
And where I began to have a problem with kind of the quote academic unquote approach to leadership was that leadership was these specific characteristics,
right,
and usually really kind attributes, right? And the character, which I'm not against kindness, mind you, but the point is that in any given situation, there's a different style of leadership that's needed. A great offensive coach on a football team is not usually a great defensive coach.
Right.
A great special teams coach is not necessarily a great head coach. A great, look in the military. A wartime general, not always a good peacetime general. Almost never. And vice versa.
Yeah.
Right. And you look at,
which is interesting, and I would add one to that too, because I think sometimes the guy that starts the organization can be the one that carries it on. They can, and other times you're a starter, but you're not necessarily a manager or builder.
Period. Every stage of that organization needs a different, unique style of leadership, and you may have a leader who either has both of those styles or can morph, or can bring in team members who will do it. But don't for a second be pulled into this idea that there is one form of this is what a leader looks like.
Yeah.
And I do some succession counseling, consulting with organizations. I see this all the time as the big mistake is all of this focus on we want a profile of a leader. They got to be this age. They got to have these. Instead of saying, what does the organization need to get to the next level? That may be something totally different, and it might not be a long-term leader.
Right.
You might need somebody to come in for 2 years and fix things.
Yeah.
And well, all of that to say, that was a very long introduction to say the same is true with culture.
Yeah.
Right. So where is the culture at? Where is it not working? Where does it need to be? Let's build that culture. Let's not copy Chick-fil-A, who has amazing culture.
Yeah.
But they're selling chickens. All right. And you may not be doing that.
Right.
And so that's not to denigrate. They've done a remarkable thing.
Oh goodness, yeah.
In a tough industry, but I don't think necessarily that's going to work in the firehouse.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing, and I love about what you're saying is I meet leaders all the time, and their organization changes, and they don't realize they have permission to change with their organization. And it's like, no, I have to be the leader I was. And so what I love is this does give fire chiefs, executives, different people that permission. Like you don't have to become something you're not, but it is okay when your culture changes to shift with it and to take on new skill sets. I think that's a permission most people don't even realize they have. They're like, no, I have to force it into the mold that fits me instead of going, hey, if you want to go with the change, you just have to change and you have permission to change and it's okay. There's nothing disingenuous about that. I think most of the leadership books I have read, it's like you figure out who you are and you just hammer what you're the hammer and you find nails and you make things nails that aren't nails instead of going, no, hey, sometimes you're the hammer. If you can adjust and be a wrench and that's what your organization needs, go ahead and do that. But if you can't, go find new nails. I love the permission and freedom it gives.
Absolutely. So anyhow, that's the tool I've spent the biggest part of my life working on, that I've been most passionate about, and that is least in demand.
So what are some of the other tools that you use a lot?
So I set out with realizing it's not going to be the 5 levers of corporate culture. There's going to be 5 levers. So I think, my motto is same effort, greater impact. So I think
Yeah.
every leader needs at least 5 really strong tools.
Yeah.
And everybody says, what are those 5 tools? And I go back to, well, I know of probably at least 12 tools, but
Yeah.
every leader is not going to have all 12. But in their given situation, their skills, their talents, what the organization needs, I hope they can develop 5 in their toolkit. But in terms of assessment tools and other tools, I've just found that when I'm in conversations with leaders and they begin to identify issues, they're things I've dealt with in the past, and I'm simply taking the things I've done in the past and now beginning to put it into a format that can work. So one of the ones that I've ended up, most of the organizations or leaders I've worked with at some point has called for this. I don't even have a great title for it. For right now, I'm just calling it same page leadership. And it comes down to this. How many times have you talked to a leader that said, if I could just get all my team onto the same page?
Yeah. Yeah.
How many times have you heard that? So I hear that a lot. So I just developed a common response. Show me the page and I'll help you do it.
Ooh, that's
What,
great.
what are you saying? I go, no, you said
Yeah.
get everybody on the same page. So show me the page.
Yeah.
Well, I don't have it. I go, well, why do you use the phrase?
Yeah.
Why do you expect everybody to get onto the same page if you haven't gone to the work to create a page?
Right. So nobody knows what that page is.
So I've created a guarantee with clients, with CEOs. If you'll give me 90 minutes alone with a flip chart and a projector and a brainstorming tool I use, and you turn off your phone, 90 minutes, we will create your one page.
Oh,
And
that's
then we'll
awesome.
have a conversation. Typically, it's around long-term vision and strategy. That's usually the big problem. And so far, that guarantee is held all but once. And so I had to say, no, I can't quite do that in 90 minutes. But it's ended up being a really, and then as they take their senior team through it, it's ended up being, I didn't set out to do that, but I clearly see there's a hunger for something that I know how to do there
Yeah.
that they just haven't quite got. So that's one. One that I'm pretty passionate about that's developed much more than I thought is creating an impact model. So particularly, I thought this would just be in the not-for-profit space, but right now, I just spent all day yesterday with a large corporate client that they're implementing this. We talk a lot about business models, right?
Right.
In our organizations, financially, here's how all the pieces need to move for this to work. But particularly in the not-for-profit world, and more in the for-profit world, organizations want to make a big impact. And somehow the only model they've had is improve the business model, improve the business model.
Right.
And what I've been sharing with leaders is your impact model is very, very different from your business model, but both of them can work just the same, but they can't be in contradiction with one another. So we know for most businesses, if you do this, plus this, here's how much revenue is going to
Right.
be created. But we don't know that about our impact. And
Right.
so mine is helping organizations to uncover what their genius is, that if we do this, and then sequentially we do this, we do this, we do this, that's the impact we can have on individuals,
That's good.
organizations, society. And once we understand what our impact model is, what? Then we can replicate it and we can scale it.
Yeah.
And I see a lot of passion coming from leaders when I help them simply to uh, unleash or reveal what they've already commonly been doing, but they just haven't codified it yet.
Yeah.
And this becomes a real engine for an organization of these are the things we do. This is the way we do them. This is the order we do them. And when we do it, we have a great impact. And separating that from the business model. So that's
I
one.
love that though. I love it. I think about churches when I've worked with churches in the past, and they'll have success, but they don't know why they had success and they don't know what they're really good at. So they just go, well, we'll just keep doing all these things, and they go into a million different directions and they diffuse it.
Yeah, I was talking to an executive pastor about this very thing last week from a mega church here in Dallas, and I said, hey, here's my thing. I've worked around that community for decades. For the better part of 20 years, every time I visited church, I've visited every size of church across America and on a number of continents. And I kind of have one question: how do you measure spiritual growth? Because
Yeah.
that's always at the heart of. And in 20 years, I've never had a great answer to that.
Yeah.
I've had, and I don't mean that as a criticism. I mean it as an area of concern. If there's an answer at all, it usually has to do with participation rates. Well,
Yeah.
we measure if they're attending this often, they're in this small group, they're part of our generosity initiatives, and to me, to be candid, that's a little bit like participation trophies
Yeah.
for our kids. You can do all of those things and not actually grow. It's not likely. I agree. All those things are good, but this was the conversation I had with this friend last week of what would it look like if we went into a church, each individual church, and said, what really is your impact engine? Because it's not the same for every church.
Right. And it doesn't have to be.
And it doesn't have to be. It doesn't need to be. You don't actually want it to be. But I think it'd be really good for churches to be very clear. This is how we're making a dent
Yeah.
in the
Do this
spiritual.
for me real quick before we go on, because you
Yeah.
said it doesn't have to be, it doesn't need to be. I think that's huge. Why is that? I mean, I have an opinion, so I don't want to, but why is it important that all churches don't look the same?
Well, because all people don't look the same.
Right.
Number one, and the needs of the community. Remember, my basic supposition is that all leadership is situational.
Yeah.
So you're in a congregation, a community of faith of people. Some of them, there is a great deal of need within that closed community to grow and get ready to do the next thing. Another one is in a physical neighborhood community
Yeah.
that has a huge opportunity and need for outreach of bringing new people in who don't know the story of Christ, who don't know the story of the church. Um, the leaders, again, you look at this, you look at leaders of churches, many of them are great pastors, they're not great leaders. Some are great leaders and have no pastoral skills and no empathy
True.
skills. Some are tremendous teachers and speakers, but they're not great leaders.
Yeah.
Again, when we go looking for leaders of those types of organizations, it's always this, yeah, this is what we want to have, but we know there's many models for leadership that will work there. I understand a case can be made theologically. I understand the theological arguments about this, that every church needs to have all of those pieces. I just don't think it actually works that way.
Yeah.
And so
Well,
it,
maybe all those pieces have to be there, but they don't all have to look the same. They don't have to be in the right order, the same.
they
Yeah.
don't have to listen. And I know even for me, over the journey of my life of what would be meaningful participation for me in a community of faith, it's a very different church now than it
Yeah.
would have been 20 years ago.
Yeah, there's Will Mancini wrote a book called Church Unique, and I'll slaughter what his terminology is for it. But I remember one of the things in there is he's talking about figuring out who you're going to be and what you're going to do is this idea of you need to consider your specific context, and
Yeah,
that has a huge play into what you do and who you are, what kind of leaders you
yeah,
have. And
yeah.
I remember reading that, and it was so foreign from a lot of the structural organizational books I've been reading that when I read that in Will's book, I was like, oh yeah, like,
Yeah.
and I think of like fire departments and police departments, where you are matters way more than whatever the national narrative, because you have to figure out what your community needs. Be great at that, and it'll probably look, Pueblo will look different than the Springs, Dallas different than Houston. Like figuring out your unique context and go, okay, let's be good at that. I love that.
Yep, yep, absolutely, totally on board with that.
So, how about one or two more tools before we kind of close out? Well, one or two more that you like.
I love working with leaders on their executive communication skills. I think
Yeah,
there's huge untapped leverage by most leaders in the way they plan communications, develop communications, deliver communications. And that one's just been a passion of mine since I was young. So I love working on that. Executive presence, developed a tool.
hmm.
One of my first, yeah. Anyhow, I don't talk much about clients, but one of the first was, here's a leader who stepped into a leadership role who doesn't yet really have strong executive presence. It's pretty much been considered you either have it or you don't. There's a lot of truth to that, but just developed a tool of how do we objectively assess a
Okay.
leader's executive presence. And if we can assess it, the theory is you can work on each one of those things and develop your own executive presence. So the executive communications, executive presence, those are pretty close. And one way or another, you don't go many months in advising any leader before you're getting into their headspace, and,
Right.
and, and
Right.
just and just correcting mindset issues
Yeah.
that either have come from long held issues or come from particular crises they're going through. And so again, I wouldn't have expected I would do as much of that. That's really on the mentoring, the personal growth side. But I do spend a lot of time working with leaders on either altering their mindset or helping them to alter their team's mindset, because it's two
Yeah.
different things that are very, if you're not quite in tune about how do I change my mindset to achieve what I want to achieve, if you're not in tune with doing that for you, it's hard to do it for your team. So for me, this is one of these leverage things. I was talking to a leader who's got 50 people in his team, in his downline. I say, if you're struggling with this, how many of your 50 team members a downline are struggling with this? He said, well, I think all of them. I said, you're probably right. If you're not getting on your game,
Yeah.
how are you going to help them? And imagine if you could take 1 hour a week and begin to change and lift the mindset of 50 players, you're going to have 100x impact in a very short period of time. And that's kind of the core question that,
Yeah.
for me, about the five levers: same effort, greater impact. One of my common questions is, if you took 1 hour a week in total solitude to consider what you could do that would get a 100x return, is there anything in that conversation? And it's quite interesting, because we're not usually looking that way. We are in the weeds. We're trying to get a 3% improvement, a
Yeah.
5% improvement, which is the way great organizations are built. But if someone, and it's going to be the leader, isn't once a week, 2 or 3 times a month, sitting for 1 hour and asking this question: how do I get a 100x impact? They may not ever achieve it, but I'll guarantee you they'll come up with a bunch of ideas that are better than 3%.
Yeah. And probably things they'll love, right? Things that they'll be like, man, I want to do that.
Transformational things.
Yeah.
Transformational things.
Yeah.
And CEO leadership doesn't often leave you much time and energy for transformation. One other tool, again, I didn't expect this. This is the last one. It's all about leadership energy management. So I've developed just a tool that's brought together a lot of technologies and learnings of how do I take, the basic theory is this: when we're young, we all study time management, and we
Right.
think that's the key. And we get better and better and better at it. And somewhere in your late 40s, you begin to understand, it doesn't matter how much time I have, I only have so much energy in a
Yeah.
given week. And not all things take the same amount of energy.
Right.
And not all things give back the same amount of energy. So the critical piece for a successful executive is to have an energy map for their week of, these are the gold hours that I have. These are
Yeah.
the high power hours. How am I going to ration those to achieve what I want to achieve? And who gets those other
That's
hours?
really cool because I think, man, how many times do we give the best hours to the worst things? And then we get to the thing that matters and we're like drained.
If you don't have a plan, the answer is always.
Yeah. Yeah.
And particularly our families.
Yeah.
You talk to a CEO, find me a CEO who doesn't have a regret some point late in their life that my family got the leftovers.
Yeah.
I came tired, but you think about it. We do all of these big Monday morning meetings because with I mean, when I go through this with executives and they see, here's how I'm wired, here's where my energy is, here's where I'm spending my energy, and we talk about how do you deal with the to-do list that are too big, and how do you deal with the energy drainers. And this isn't rocket science. It's just an older man's perspective on when I started doing this. I traveled heavily in my career for years, heavy travel schedule. And a few years back, I was planning a trip And I realized I'm looking at this trip and all these appointments in this city that I'm flying to, and I'm looking for where's the spot that I can get a nap. Now I'm kind of embarrassed. I'm kind of embarrassed to say that on your, but that became a real thing that if
Yeah.
I did all this in the morning and I was going to do that evening thing, I had to have some quiet time. And I realized it's not about time management. Energy is the only thing I've got.
Yeah.
And I've got to invest it well. And if I invest it well, I get far greater results.
Yeah.
Same amount of hours. So anyhow, that's a tool again, one of those that I didn't anticipate doing it, but it's a need, and so I developed the tool.
Dude, I love it. So let me do this right before we end. If and you're not going to ask for this, you didn't ask for this, so I'm just going to do it, and you suck it up, and that's all right. If someone wants to work with you, how do they? What's a good way for them to communicate with you? Because I imagine that there'll be people who hear this and they go, "Okay, I know that I've wanted to have some of that advisement in my life, but I'm just not into everything that I've seen so far. I'm really connecting with Dusty. I like what he has to say. I want to press into some of these things." How do they connect with you so that they can start that dialogue?
Simplest way is by email. It's just dusty@the5levers.com. So I don't know if you'll post that on your,
Yeah, I can put it in there.
when you put it, just dusty at the, I don't have a website. Maybe someday I will. I haven't set out to build a company. I'm not planning on hiring anybody. And so it's very easy to reach me by email, dusty@the5levers.com. I'm on LinkedIn, easy to find there. And so do that. Send me an email. We'll hop on the phone. I just love to have a 20 or 30-minute call with somebody, find out where their pain points are. And if we identify something that I think I can help with, we'll define it. Very easy to work with. I don't have long-term contracts or any such thing. We look at what's the need. Let's design a program to get after it. But first of all, let's just have a conversation. If I don't think I can help, very easy for me to say, I can't help you, but I probably know somebody who can. So
Awesome. That's awesome. It's so good, man. So let me give you 2, 3 minutes. You can say anything you want. This is the end of the interview. So say, I mean, you can say why the Broncos are better than the Cowboys. Maybe.
yeah, that I'm not going to get it.
You're
No,
not gonna-
I think I've said what I want. Listen, if you are a listener and you've accepted the call of leadership in your life, you've accepted a good call, and it is a heavy burden, and I applaud you and I encourage you, and just as a reminder, a life of service, uh, people will drain you, and will use up every ounce of patience that you have, but it is worthwhile.
yeah.
We need great leaders. We need intentional leaders. We need growing leaders. We need learning leaders. We need humble leaders. I just want to encourage all of your listeners on their journey. It's worth the work. So
Awesome.
thanks,
Thank you so
thanks
much,
so much
Dusty.
for what you're doing. Thanks for what you're doing, Michael.
Absolutely. God bless, bud.